It all seemed like a bad joke, a dream state. After all, what can you believe in? What's out there to support you? Isn't it just better to retreat? It can't possibly be happening. What can you do? That was Japan's zeitgeist, as strange as it was. And that's precisely the zeitgeist that watched Anno Hideaki and Gainax's monumental apocalyptic tale, Neon Genesis Evangelion.
I should make one big note. Evangelion wasn't the only notable apocalyptic text to emerge in the 90s, and whereas Evangelion is particularly important because of its ties to the otaku, literature was formulating a specific type of text, the iyashike, and in the early to mid-90s there was an iyashike manga that is incredibly important to understand, Hitoshi Ashinano's soothing, healing apocalypse, Yoko Hama買い出し紀行. From June 1994 to February 2006, Yoko Hama買い出し紀行, YKK going forward, is the story of an android named Alpha who runs an unsuccessful coffee shop. What is particularly important about YKK is that it's set in a post-apocalyptic backdrop. Mount Fuji has erupted and the sea levels have risen dramatically. Climate change has affected everyone to the point where human civilization is thinning out. And yet, the story is peaceful. YKK carries several hallmarks of iyashike literature. Its descriptions are precise and transparent, oftentimes evoking sensory elements. The consistent and persistent motion of the frames enclose and frame characters through ultimately safe environments. Laden throughout the story are clues to questions that are never really meant to be answered. Paul Roquette, in describing what he calls ambient literature and healing text, notes all three of these as essentially components of iyashike texts. They emphasize a drive to wander, to ponder, but never to feel true discomfort. Everything is done safely. Though there may be problems, iyashike texts are ultimately returning to a relaxing equilibrium. And this is particularly important for YKK, whereas Evangelion is a Lacanian apocalypse. YKK seems Heideggerian. Martin Heidegger, in the context of environments and simplified for this video, argues that our understanding of nature is derivative, that we don't really understand it as a base being separate from us. He also stresses that to us, nature is often framed through what he considers to be technology, a way of revealing nature. When we pull back even further, spaces are reconstituted through our understanding of them. This brings up an important question in YKK. What happens to the space when the people understanding them are no longer there? In YKK, the sunken city of Yokohama lights itself at night, a sparkling array, dizzying and vivid under blue twilight. When Alpha gets a camera, she experiences the environment as something to take a picture of. She asks herself when and why has she become so picky in taking pictures, and yet, at the moment where she can take that picture of Enoshima, she is unable to do so. She went there understanding the environment as something to take a picture of, but there is a force beyond her understanding of it as something to be harnessed, something that surrounds her. Stylistically, the space itself is given a life. The bubbles in chapter 25 describe the sea in a dualistic lens, that of the sea separate from human control, and that of its old identity, a beach. The monologue states maybe it doesn't look back on the days when it was a summer vacation resort, injecting a somewhat totemistic power. The lights that grow parallel to the man-made streetlights, the large mushroom-like growths that look like buildings, the statues that look like people. These too are elements of the environment that we as readers perceive through our lens. They look like streetlights, they look like buildings, they look like people. They and us. But is that distinction meaningful, necessary? YKK is asking us to consider what that environment means, what that is. And Ashinano's style magnifies its life. Panels without people are given energy through the movement of the hatching. The interplay between light and dark controls our senses of human technology. The illumination is environmental. The mythos behind so much of its mutation separates humans and yet bonds them to the environment. When Alpha's cafe is blown away in a typhoon, she makes a makeshift porch that merges the sounds and smells of the summer season into her space. This all emphasizes a return. YKK's calming apocalypse and the response of the world's inhabitants emphasize a focus on harmonious living. In magnifying the environment, we're presented with the idea that we are one with it, or that we should aim to be one with it. Alpha, as an android that is, for the sake of the story, immortal, acts as both an insert and a chronicler of the age. She acts as a world camera upon which we can see the return. Just as we watch her, she watches the world of YKK. Like us, she is unable to understand it. All she can do is simply exist. In this context, the environment can therefore be a call to remaining steadfastly in the social system. That with the puncture of Japan's bubble economy, the environment, society, is the healing mechanism we can expect from this healing text. Whereas Akira emphasized the confusion of the environment and Evangelion emphasized the environment as a sort of black box, YKK's environment is brought forward to enmesh us with it. And this equilibrium, this return to a zero state, underlines a lot of Iyashike literature. Roquette notes that mood regulation went as far back as the late 70s, peaking around the late 90s. And interestingly, they have some notable commonalities. In mitigating disruption in the text, it pushes a person forward and then brings them back. After all, the very idea of healing is to bring someone back to a zero state, and the healing boom did happen because of the Kobe earthquake and the Shinrikyo attacks. Furthermore, they serve a very specific purpose in broader apocalyptic discourse. To live the apocalypse through a peaceful, calm death suggests a death that should, nevertheless, emphasize harmony, that to trust in the world is to be healed by it. In this context, YKK reinforces people to return to the social order, a contrast to Evangelion and the Sakaike fiction it spawned. But YKK is also important because this rhetoric of harmony is close, although not synonymous, to another important idea. See, after the Shinrikyo attack, Miyadai Shinji coined the term Owarinaki Nichijo, meaning endless everyday, to understand what happened. To Shinji, in an affluent society, to exist within a comfortable Japan is to realize a stasis, you continually existing within an unmoving, unchanging position. You are living an endless every day. And there is something romantic about the end of the world, that to survive it is to be freed from a particular sensibility, a crushing sensibility. That's what Shinji meant when Shinrikyo was trying to attack this endless every day, to remove this continuous roteness. Tsunehiro captures the idea quite well. There will be no Big Bang, he says. For YKK, there was no Big Bang. For Alpha, there's just the everyday. So why is this important? Well, it's because the idea of an endless everyday is useful to framing the idea of the Nichijouke. Starting with Azumanga Daioh but popularized by Lucky Star and K-On!, the Nichijouke is notable because of how it depicts senses of, well, the everyday. Also called Kukike, atmosphere or air types, the Nichijouke, or everyday types, are particularly important because of their social registry. We easily understand them as cute girls doing cute things, but it is important to understand the social theory behind these texts. Nichijouke series are major foregroundings of the everyday, whereas Sakaike link the foreground to the background, Nichijouke are dominantly foreground. Through emphasizing the daily actions, they minimize clear leading plots. Through the lack of a sufficient male character as part of its central roster, they eliminate any real romances since romantic development is itself a development. There are, in Tanaka's words, no serious confrontations, arguments, or fights, no suffering, and really no problems at all. In addition, Nichijouke stories oftentimes encourage pilgrimages linking the virtual with the real. This creates, according to Tsunehiro, an augmented reality where parts of our lives are influenced by fictitious forces. Takanomiya Shrine in Lucky Star, for instance, is based off a shrine in real life. This is the connection that expands the here and now. Now, Nichijouke aren't often apocalyptic, since the apocalyptic story is itself a huge risk when we're trying to depict a world purely on foreground. However, if we borrow elements of the Nichijouke to understand social malaise in apocalyptic texts, theoretically we could get some telling insights on this idea of an endless everyday. After all, to be able to live this endless everyday is to be comfortable to do so. So what happens when that's removed? From January to March 2010, Sora no Woto is an interesting apocalyptic tale. Revolving around 5 girls in the town of Seas, Sora no Woto's first half shows Kanata Soromi acclimate to her environment, practice the trumpet, and ultimately learn about the town and the people around her. On the surface, Sora no Woto is easily understood as cute girls doing cute things with a post-apocalyptic background. And that's exactly why it's a fascinating text. That's really interesting. Remember, Nichijouke stories try to minimize clear leading plots, mitigate romances with any identifiable male character, and oftentimes incorporate real-world locations to create a flitting sensation of the virtual and the real. Sora no Woto attempts to accomplish all of them and, at the same time, arguably questions them. Though there is an escalation in the latter half with an ending, the end result of this is a return to a state of zero. Rio leaving near the end of the show is then returned to zero with her coming back. The spider being repaired does not necessarily affect the major world around them. It plays a role, but ultimately it's not what decides the end result. In fact, Rio's concerns on the desertification of the world emphasizes how ultimately nothing has truly changed. The problem persists. There's also no clear male insert. While Klaus exists and he is the target of Kureha's infatuation, the difference in their ages and Klaus's fake identity implies there is no clear romantic fruition. In effect, their relationship is toothless and likely would never lead to any reasonable plot that would lead to a linear structure that could compromise the Nichijouke feel. Seas itself is a town based off Cuenca, Spain, thus making it ripe for pilgrimages. The entirety of Sora no Woto is, in fact, a smorgasbord of references from the real world, an extreme accentuation of Tsunehiro's augmented reality. In Sora no Woto, the idea of here and now has expanded to comically massive lengths. And yet, despite these telltale hallmarks of Nichijouke texts, Sora no Woto is not entirely a pure Nichijouke show. Though it does go far enough with Kureha's infatuation, it is an infatuation nevertheless. Though it does signify a return to the everyday at the end of the story, the existence of a climax nevertheless moves it further away from what we might consider to be pure Nichijouke series. And though there are pilgrimages through the emphasis on an expanded here and now, is this necessarily a space that would legitimately expand on the here and now? In fact, the second episode shows the clear divisions that Sora no Woto is tackling. Going through an abandoned school, it cleaves the new world of the girls from the old one. The girls do not understand kanji, simply referring it to ideograms. Furthermore, the girls have no clear understanding of the layout and purpose of the school itself. If we look at Nichijouke shows like Azumanga Daioh, Lucky Star, and K-On!, they emphasize school settings because these are settings that would magnify the everyday with minimal conflict. What Sora no Woto is doing is by introducing the school as a conflictual space in the second episode, it magnifies its roots and yet criticizes them. It's a rupture, and still it's unafraid to recall these Nichijouke elements where it deems fit. In other words, it's somewhat hypocritical, paradoxical, but it was only able to do so because of its apocalyptic backdrop. Sora no Woto uses the apocalypse to build upon Nichijouke elements to test these sensibilities. In an episode, Rio asks what meaning there was in the world. A show like K-On! Might emphasize that every day. But that's not what Felicia believes. That's not what Sora no Woto believes. At the heart of both YKK and Sora no Woto is the idea of a harmonious life. A ravaged world that is nevertheless lived in relative peace by its inhabitants, striving for harmony, stasis, equilibrium. But whereas YKK's harmony allows humanity to calmly go into the night, Sora no Woto's is much more critical. Sora no Woto fights for change even as it attempts to embrace the everyday. YKK does not. And this is even more important considering that a year later, we find the limits of complacency, of harmony. I want to end, as Motoko Tanaka does, very briefly on Fukushima. But whereas Tanaka's focus on Fukushima was partly on its nuclear and postmodern identities, I want to focus on the idea of a paradoxical harmony. On March 11, 2011, an earthquake struck the Pacific Ocean northeast of Japan in the Tohoku region. The largest earthquake in Japanese history, it generated tsunami waves that killed roughly 16,000 people and left roughly 2,700 unaccounted for. This earthquake and tsunami damaged 4 reactors of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. We cannot underestimate the sheer disruptive power Fukushima had on Japanese popular culture, let alone apocalyptic discourse. Tanaka argues that the Fukushima disaster revealed Japanese equality as a myth. Hiroko Furukawa and Reina Dennison note that many works post-Fukushima were largely healing in nature. Nobuhiko Obayashi has mentioned that Takahata's Tale of Princess Kaguya was influenced by the events at Fukushima. Production from Up on Poppy Hill had controlled schedules. Miyazaki himself urged staff members to not stop production so they could empathize with disaster victims. Stories like Dimension W and Big Order, which themselves looked at the frightening paradox of energy, emerged in a post-Fukushima setting. There are so many things we can focus on with Fukushima, so I just want to focus on one brief thing. Tsunehiro's description of the role of the disaster is apt. He notes that through exposure to considerable violence, people's attention is drawn to the structure of their world. It's not a matter of what the earthquake or accident changed, but rather how they emphasized existing connections. I think these words can be taken as revelatory, to lay structures bare, and at the heart of this is a paradoxical harmony. Keiko Hirata and Mark Warschauer argue that not only did major miscommunications exist between Tokyo Electric Power Corporation and the Japanese government, but also both complacency and unwillingness to divulge the worst. Hirata and Warschauer argue that a lack of preparation was partly because of a safety myth, that the company worried that training for severe accidents might suggest the possibility of severe accidents, or that preparing for a disaster was to invite disaster. Kentaro Takakuma expressed similar sentiments when he described his concerns with the pro-nuclear crowd. He chides, if you were to prepare for an accident, it means you are predicting and putting into words that an accident that will never happen will happen. In other words, a toxic paradoxical harmony was established. The same softness, stability, and stasis that we saw in Yokohama買い出し紀行was morphed into an inept bureaucracy. Nobody really wanted to rock the boat. Ultimately, faith was lost in both organizations. The very harmony used to crop up a system that would support an affluent life was also the magnifier of a catastrophe that would force it to come crashing down. The texts that emerged were also reactions to try and understand and deal with these disasters, to mend and keep together whatever sense of harmoniousness a country had. But critical response revealed the ugliness of toxic harmony. And what of Sorano Woto? What of YKK? What of those endless everydays? The harmony we see in those stories. There was fear and trepidation, but there was also fearsome exhilaration. Takekuma tweeted on April 13, 2011, that the post-Fukushima world is one with no manual. Otaku expression has no choice but to change, because the otaku lifestyle is one that presumes an affluent everyday life. Manga and anime will, of course, still exist, but the nature of expression is sure to change. I don't know how it will yet, but it will in some way. It makes me uneasy, but also excited.
Well, it's been 6 months since this project started. I hope you guys enjoyed this really anticlimactic ending to understanding disaster. I've left some additional notes in a page that you can check in the video description if you have any further concerns, or if you just want to read a little bit more of my thoughts on this last video. And really sorry that it just ends just kind of like this with no real clear conclusion, but I mean, that's sort of the interesting thing about it. It's still something that's it's still ongoing, and I think that's really interesting and beautiful about it. If you guys like the video, please give it a like. Please subscribe if you haven't yet. Definitely check out my Patreon if you're interested in supporting the content. And yeah, I hope you guys are excited for the next multi-video project. I've already been working on it for quite a few weeks, almost to a month or so. Yeah, that's pretty much it. I hope you guys enjoy your day, and peace.